So before we get started today, we thought that it would be useful to reflect on some facts that call attention to the needs of the LGBTQ plus community. And really, we're focusing on this for Pride Month. Noelle and I were taking a break this month, or for the next 2 months, and then all of a sudden we're like, we're going to do some episodes to really highlight Pride and just really the community as well. So LGBT youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. LGBT youth are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth. In a national study, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt, and 92% of these individuals reported having attempted suicide before the age of 25. LGBT youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide as LGBT peers who reported no or low levels of family rejection. And each episode of LGBT victimization, such as physical or verbal harassment or abuse, increases this likelihood of self-harming behavior by 2.5 times on average. So some really devastating and scary statistics.
Yeah, and these are just some of the disproportionate outcomes regarding suicide and self-harm. But we know that in addition to this, we also see higher rates of depression, victimization, homelessness, the list goes on. Ian, you've taught me a lot about that just from our work together. I've just learned so much about these adverse outcomes, particularly for this community. So some people want to weaponize those statistics and discuss them in a way that posits LGBTQ plus identity as the cause of those outcomes. However, we know that this isn't the case. So can you discuss for our listeners the impact of discrimination and victimization on the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to kind of start with speaking to anyone who's listening. Maybe heard that when you were reading the data, you were saying LGB and then separately talked about transgender youth. And so some people might wonder, well, why did you separate it like that? And so the youth for LGB, lesbian, gay, and bisexual students, that's actually specific to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey here in our state, where we then have national data that talks about the experience of trans students. And so for anyone who wonders, well, why? Why are these separate? Why don't we have Florida-specific data for our trans youth? And that alone should point out to part of the problem, right? We aren't asking what the experiences of our trans youth are here in our state. So we have to rely on that national data that shows what the harmful impacts of discrimination and victimization can have on the students. And that erasure alone, I think, speaks to what so many of our kids' experiences are in our schools. This is, I love that you all are doing this for Pride Month, and I think it's, any time we're able to elevate LGBTQ identities, I think is so important. But for so many kids that I work with, they'll say, I live in a city that got perfect score on the different indexes that are put out there. And the city does all these things to support us. But that's not what I feel. That's not my experience here in our schools. And so much of this work is incredibly difficult because people are always talking about what we can do in our communities to support adults, but very rarely is that same effort and energy put into how do we support, how do we uplift, how do we empower, how do we support and protect and affirm our youth as well. And so when we talk about the impacts of this discrimination, when we talk about the impacts of this victimization, here in our schools, I always tell people when we do trainings. So we've trained about 30,000 principals, counselors, social workers, teachers, deans, the full gamut of Florida professionals. And what we tell them is being LGBTQ in itself is not a risk factor. It's the societal discrimination, it's the harassment from your peers, it's the lack of affirming spaces, of the unresponsiveness of their teachers. That is what creates the anxiety and the depression and the fear in a child that then would result in many of those data points that you shared. And so, I always am grounded back in the importance of our kids being able to show up and attend school so that they can learn and so that they can grow and so that they can graduate successfully, right? And so when we think of our kids, big misconception that we often hear, and doing this work, we get pushback constantly. People are saying, yeah, but how many kids are you talking about? And that's where we are able to circle back to the data and say, this is 18.2% of Florida high school students who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or unsure of their sexual orientation, as well as 1.5% as trans. So it's a lot more kids than people realize, and yet their experiences are still very much ones that a child should not have to go through to be able to attend school.